Okay, Dwayne's probably gonna load up his presentation pretty quick. And just for those of you who haven't been on, and I'm sure a lot of you have, the presenter today is Dr. Dwayne Beck. He manages the research farm, the Dakota Lakes Research Farm, located just east of Pierre. He's been doing that since 1990, so quite a few years. And you know, predominantly worked with no-till and the cropping systems here in the central part of the state that are popular. So
Dakota Lakes Research Farm is located along the Missouri River, east of Pierre, South Dakota. It's a bit drier than maybe a lot of people that are on the program. We had a virtual field day this year. I would encourage you to go to our YouTube page and or get a hold of me, and I can download this link. And I think that link's also at our website. But it's quite good on rotations and some of the phosphorus work and things we're doing. And we specifically looked at soil impacts of different rotations over the years. Natural ecosystems are all polycultures. So the subject today is basically polycultures, or different ways of doing more diverse systems. The ecosystems are highly diverse unless they've been impacted by outside factors. So when we came here, everything was pretty much a diverse polyculture. It had these deep-rooted prairie plants that did a good job of cycling nutrients, very active root systems year-round, and we've replaced those with annual cropping, which creates some problems. The natural ecosystems, the diverse ecosystems, they did a good job of cycling the water. So we had the water cycle working, the energy flow. They were harvesting something every time the sun was shining. They were doing something there. Mineral cycle, of course, right now we have problems in the state with pHs going down in places because the lime and things are just going away because we're not cycling back to the surface. And then we're kind of low in diversity. So I call this catch and release nutrients when we bring the lime and stuff back up. And so when we do, especially perennial polycultures or polycultures with perennials in there, that's one of the things that's happening. I think eventually we're going to have to realize that we need to use perennials in our farming systems in order to do this right. Right now we're trying to address it with drainage style and those kind of things, but places like the Jim River Valley and in eastern South Dakota, where there's quite a bit of rainfall, I think we need to go back and kind of rethink what we're doing for systems. Natural ecosystems provide diversity in space and time. So there's diversity on a small scale in space, and then also in time, because that changes over the year. Managed agricultural ecosystems right now are mostly annual cropping, and they give you diversity in time if you do it right. A lot of them aren't even doing that. Corn, soybean is a 2-crop monoculture, for instance, and we used to have wheat and fallow here, which was the same thing. But little in space within a year. So that becomes somewhat of an issue. If you get an insect or something comes in, it's got carte blanche to take everybody. Diverse crop rotations can help prevent resistant biotype weed and insect issues because of the diversity in sequence and intervals. And also it improves the productivity. We have a lot of data on this in terms of what happens with productivity and those kind of things. We don't have that in this slideshow today, but we will in a week or so be doing one for Ruth on crop rotations. Also gives you better ecosystem services and improves your soil property, which is on that virtual field day. What happened is, once we probably got to the 1950s or so, technological developments like pesticides and fertilizers and transportation and those things allowed the industry to create linear input-output systems instead of the circular systems that we had here before we started farming. Linear input-output systems degrade the ecosystem and prove to be unstable over time. The systems are basically a mining operation, and there was a speaker by the name of Darren Qualman at the No-Till on the Plains here a few weeks ago that has spent quite a bit of time researching this, going all the way back to when man first started to farm. Weeds and diseases are nature's way of adding diversity to a system that lacks diversity, and we spend a lot of time trying to counter that by whacking things. I call it whack-a-mole farming. We can actually offset this nature's efforts to add diversity by just adding diversity of our own. And that's part of what happens with polycropping, or the attempts that people are doing with polycropping. We've had no need to apply a broadcast insecticide on the main farm at Dakota Lakes for 17 years. We do use some seed treatments because we have to, because we can't really get the seed easily without them on there. And other than that, we really haven't had to do anything. We do use some BT technology for corn borer. Techniques that can provide diversity in space have names that include polycropping, intercropping, strip cropping, relay cropping, pasture cropping, and whatever. So when you start talking about this whole subject of adding diversity, there's all these names. So we're going to go through a few of those just to kind of define what those are. And they're mostly just names that people make up, but whatever. Mixed intercropping, they define as being seeded together and harvested together. Either being grazed, hayed, swathed, or actually combined. Annual forage cover crop type things are the most common, and we have quite a few people doing those where they're doing a forage cover crop type thing. Perennial forages, in other words, alfalfa and orchard grass and whatever, is also an example. The ones that we have used over the years, and we've been doing this type of thing for 30 years at times. Peas and oats was probably the first one that we did, and it was because the peas themselves at that time were very long vined and would fall down flat on the ground. So we would mix them with either oats or with flax, which is the next one, flax and peas. And that would hold the pea up. It also actually does a good job of stopping a lot of the leaf diseases in peas that come on because of the flax being there, especially, and chickpeas and flax is very common in areas because of the benefits to preventing ascochyta disease. Now they can spray fungicides, but the ascochyta is getting resistant very quickly to fungicides. So this is a way they're handling that. So that's quite popular in areas where they grow chickpeas. Canola and peas, kind of the same thing. You notice that with the exception of peas and oats, that there's a large difference in seed size. So that allows you to sort the flax out relatively easily. And I say that tongue in cheek because my guys don't really think it's all that easy when they're sitting out there sorting the flax out of the peas, but we're doing that at the present time. And then the flax is getting crushed and the peas are being sold. So we do have a place that we can put those as a mixed crop and get the moisture straightened out and then sort them out later on. The Three Sisters is the farming system of the Native American farmers. It was a polyculture with, and it was used all the way up and down Mexico and all the way up through here. Mixture of corn, edible bean, climbing beans, so they would climb up the corn plant, and then they would have squash mixed in there to kind of get the ground cover and keep the weeds back. And it also did some things for insects, which were kind of interesting. We have done a mix of edible beans and corn at one time to try to take advantage of that climbing thing. But the problem is you really can't have you can't have corn seed in with your edible beans or whatever. So it makes that a bit more difficult if you're hand harvesting, or as I'll mention later in the future, if we if we have precision ag things with little machines that can go out and actually harvest more like a human, then that might work. Mixed intercropping, we have better competition with weeds. Obviously, with oats and peas, there's nothing you can do out there for weeds in terms of in crop. And there's not a lot you can do as far as soil applied. So, but it doesn't appear to be, it usually isn't a problem for us. So we have better competition with weeds, the same way with oats and peas and those kind of things. We will harvest oats and peas together and don't bother sorting them out because we use those for feed. And that's kind of the guys that are doing oats and peas, they just use it for feed. If they're makes a nice balanced ration if you do it right, because the peas have protein and the oats have the fiber. Reduce diseases through interference and insects for the same reason. It kind of confuses them. Mike Brendison did both his master's and PhD on things like that at SDSU, and I'd encourage you to go over and take a look at his PhD thesis where he talks about, especially in terms of insects, talks about the advantage of cover cropping and polycropping type systems where you're growing something in there. The improved standability is probably the biggest one. It's not as big a thing in peas anymore as it used to be because the peas knit together, but it gives them better harvest characteristics because they're standing up there where you can get at them. And we can actually, with flax and peas, use a stripper head to harvest both of them. And now we leave the last one, the more resilient residue. One of the biggest problems with peas is they don't really have and soybeans are similar, don't have a good enough residue to stop what you need to have happen in South Dakota with wind and things in the wintertime, and we like to catch some snow. So if we do the pea and flax together and harvest the stripper head, we get snow catch. And if we harvest it with a flex head, which is the other way you can do it, you have more resilient residue because that flax doesn't go anywhere and the pea decomposes very quickly. Mixed intercropping, some of the issues are maturity differences. You got to have the peas and the chickpeas and the peas and the peas and the flax and the chickpeas and the flax maturing about the same time or it gets difficult. There's a harvest bottleneck if you're trying to clean on the go, and we have had times when we use just low rates of the flax and put screens on the combine and just let the flax fall through. And so it's not really even coming into the building, it's just staying in the field, and then it volunteers and becomes our snow fence. Now, the bad news is you can't really tell the FSA guy what you're doing because they don't allow you to do that because they don't know what to call it. So it doesn't really impact us because we're not really doing that much of that. But for a real farmer, crop insurance and FSA regulations are something he needs to check into before he starts doing this, because it's really not a good thing if they find out later. Herbicide issues are real there, and we don't use that much herbicide or don't have to because of our good rotation. So it's not been that big a thing, but it could be for some, and it depends on which ones they are. Now, there are things like if you do flax and peas or chickpeas and flax, you can use sulfentrazone. In both of those, you can use prowl water, and in both of those, you can use prowl water in canola and peas and we use it as a fall spring split. So we'll do 2/3 in the fall and 1/3 in the spring, but you can't be doing some of the other things that we use in peas and chickpeas when you're doing the flax. So, and you can't do some things you do in flax like bromoxynils and those kind of things. So there's some rotational interval issues. Aphanomycetes, for instance, in the seminar earlier this week, they talked about a rotational interval of 6 to 8 years. And so if you're trying to do peas as a crop, and then you're also throwing them into one of these polycrops, or you're throwing them into your cover crop, then you start goofing up your intervals. Now, where we do peas, we normally try to get 4 to 6 years between peas. So where we do these polycultures will usually be in areas where we don't do other broadleaf crops in there. So we will stack where Chris Graham has his pea trials, for instance. We have a 3-way rotation that we stack end to end. So it goes from winter wheat to corn to flax, and then winter wheat to milo to peas. And so we don't intercrop in that rotation where he is, because we don't want to bring Aphiphomites across into him. So it makes things more complex for the human. It also makes it more complex for the insects and things and the weeds. But the other kind of intercropping is section intercropping, where you have alternate rows or sections. And when I first started, which was centuries ago, it became a real trendy thing to do in the Corn Belt, to plant alternate strips of corn and soybeans. And I do have lots of slides of that, and they haven't been scanned in. I think I have one that's been scanned in, but that was really popular at that time. It was showy, and then it just kind of went away. In the old days, in the 50s, they did these corn oats meadow type strips in the 50s and before, when they were trying to do that for soil erosion purposes and whatever. Now those strips like that, there's some nice advantages, and there's some significant disadvantages. And we also had a lot of people, especially west of here, north and west of here, where they did strips of wheat and summer fallow, for instance, where they kept those in place from a soil erosion standpoint for wind erosion. And sometimes the strips are good and sometimes they're bad. In the case of the wheat fallow type strips, the wheat sawfly, where you hear about having a lot of sawfly problems in Montana, whatever, that's where they come from, because the sawfly is not a good flyer. So he has to be relatively close to where he's going to attack. So with the alternate strips, you had a obvious problem there. And if you had big fields, he would impact along the edge, but not out in the middle if you had a couple other crops in between the wheat crops. Sections narrower than the seeder or harvester, but wider than the rows is the other thing that people are doing. We got these wider strips, and then we got ones that are narrower. This is one that's kind of getting a lot of play now. So corn soybean strips were 2 or more planter passes wide, each or at least the width of a sprayer usually. The older strips like wheat fallow and those with meadow in them were some multiple of a cedar width. And the goal was to do the soil conservation thing. Now the corn soybean strips, if you're 2 cedar passes wide, the trick that we did is you get more sunlight on the outside of the corn strip, for instance. So we would put a very long day hybrid in the outside, let's say the right row of the planter, and then step that down as we went to the left. And if we went around counterclockwise, then we had the more sunlight on the edge, and we could mature that long season thing. And we did some testing. We had like 340 bushel corn in the outside row because it was getting so much more sunlight, but it inhibited the soybeans. Skip row cotton is kind of where a lot of this started. They had 2 rows of cotton and a gap of 2 rows, and that was a farm bill thing. They only had to count the acres they planted. It was a Southern senator type thing that they blew it past these Northern guys. And so if you had a 200 acre field and you did skip row cotton, it was only counted as 100 acres. And it goes back to when they limited the acres of cotton. And of course they got more yield per acre on that 100 acres that's in the 200 acre field. And so they were happy as heck, and they've kept that thing. It's still there and they still do it, but it's whatever. They do this in parts of Africa. When Paul Carson was in Botswana, they were doing things like this on sandy soils and long growing seasons, because the roots could grow out into those areas in between and get some moisture from there as the season went on. And they would grow some veggies and things out there in the middle of that gap. Recent attempts with this idea is this 60-inch row thing you hear a lot about if you go to soil health things and whatever, and they're just leaving out one row. They have 30-inch corn planters and leaving out one every other row, and then they'll come back and try to seed cover crops in there, or they'll seed something at planting time. But it's either at that time or later. Usually it's a cover crop or a forage crop. Some are attempting to utilize this for grazing chickens, which, you know, these little chicken tractor things, and they run them down there through the middle to eat the insects, which probably is okay to do. We have some of these. We attempted to put sheep in there one time. That didn't go well. So our technique wasn't very good. Another common pattern is to see 2 rows and leave 1 blank, and that's actually what we're doing. So you have a paired row of corn usually, and a 1 blank. It means 2/3 of the area is seeded instead of where, like the cotton, where it's half, and the skip is seeded to an annual or perennial, often a legume. We have a skip row test with 2 20-inch rows of corn, one skip row, which makes that 40 inches wide, where we can grow something. So in a total of 60 inches, we have 2 rows of corn and then a row of this alfalfa is what we use. So my population looks like it would in a farmer's field, where he had 30-inch rows, because in 60 inches, he has 2 rows, and 60 inches, I have 2 rows. I've just slid them together basically. And so it looks a lot like that with that bigger gap. The corn population per acre remains the same. So the corn and corn inter row space, the space between corn plants, is the same as a producer using a 30-inch planter. The deep-rooted alfalfa cycles nutrients to the surface. So that's bringing our lime and gypsum back to the surface. We don't harvest the alfalfa. The cows will eat on it when they're grazing in the fall. That's the first place they go, and they'll kind of eat that all up. But they don't leave, that doesn't leave the field there either. They just redeposit it. Corn yield, if we look at our data, we've got areas with no gaps and areas with the skips or the gaps, and then we have either with and without alfalfa across there. The corn yields in the area without skips and without alfalfa is slightly better than the other areas. And we've got Roundup Ready alfalfa, which takes care of the weed control thing to a large extent. You have to do a few other things. The corn with alfalfa and skips in experiences less insect predation, and Michael Brennison talked about that. That's one of the sites that he used. So we have less disease issues and insect predation, because got that wider area to get some wind moving through there for the diseases. And then of course the insects, we have lots of predators, so it gives them a home. If you go narrow sections, they challenge mechanization. And we can plant those, but we couldn't really harvest something out of there. Some creative harvest solutions have been developed for guys doing that. It's more in the relay cropping thing. And we did a lot of this type of thing in the relay cropping idea back again in the 80s, and it really is more work than it's worth in a lot of ways. Often the interrow is forage or cover crops. Use of legumes is common, and seeding of this with the modern planters with center fill and stuff is pretty complex to get that all done if you're going to do that. And we do have a center fill thing, and we figured out how to fool it. But Section intercropping gives you similar advantages to mixed systems. That disease thing, the interference, and again, Michael in that PhD thesis talks about all these different things that cause insects and diseases to be less, and it's very distinct. Pesticide concerns are common because you can maybe get by with stuff, but it isn't labeled. So now what do you do with that? That's not something that we can really push if a guy is going off label. Strip cropping requires more trips to each field. And when we did the corn soybean strips, that's the thing to us that killed it, and killed it for the farmer, because you have to go there once to seed your corn, and then you come home, and then you go back a week or so later and seed your beans, but you spray your corn. So you drive 10 miles and you spray half a field, and then you go back a couple weeks later and drive 10 miles and spray a half a field. And you got this problem of, if you had to put an insecticide on and it's labeled for beans but not for corn, and you're splatting it across there and whatever, it causes some real concern. Same thing happens when you harvest. You got to go out there and harvest half a field and then come back later. So they do increase your sunlight capture, especially some of these things with the perennials in them. Inter-row seeding is where you come in between the rows later in the year. You don't leave that bigger gap. You come in, and there's quite a bit of work going on in that with the high boys and stuff. I'm not necessarily a fan of that. I just think farmers are going to get frustrated trying to do that because it's going to rain, they can't get it done, and then there's too much crop damage or whatever. I think we had the idea one time of using seed coats to hold stuff back and then let it start coming later. If you go in at the same time you seed, you can reduce your corn yield. So, and that's kind of what happens to us. The alfalfa gets pretty growthy in there, and we knock it back, but it still is taking some things away from the corn. The inter-row is seeded with the main crop or later. Aerial seeding or specialized seeder is needed, and aerial seeding, if we can make it work, would be great. And we've tried to do that. They make that work further east where it's more humid and stuff, but we have some issues getting that done. We spent quite a bit of Howard Buffett's money trying to make it work, but this inter-row seeding can be used to increase biological activity and provide living cover after harvest of the first crop. And I think that that's really where it has its main fit. And especially if guys are grazing, to put something in there, and then that would come on later and could be grazed in the fall, like a winter triticale or something in a corn crop. Flax with sunflowers, one thing we did quite a bit of work on at one time, because sunflowers have a tendency to blow, sunflower stubble, when they get seeded in the spring. So we try to get some flax growing in between the sunflower rows and to give us snow catch. I still think that has some benefit in that we have to figure out what we were hurting our sunflowers at times, so we have to work on that. So it needs some work. Most of these techniques, I think, need some work if we're going to do them, and then you start introducing this issue again of rotational intervals and such. Corn and soybean inter-row seeded is something we've looked at. This was done at Cronin Farms with Dan Forgey a number of years ago. Those are Roundup Ready forage soybean out of the south, so they'll never put on seed. And he planted them. You can see the corn's up pretty good, and then the beans are just coming up in the left photo there. And a week or so later on the, maybe a couple of weeks later on the right. And then if we went back out there, this is an area where we put no nitrogen. We did some with and without nitrogen. Where we did no nitrogen, on the left, you can see that it's very nitrogen deficient, but it didn't have the soybeans there. And on the right, it had the soybeans there, and it gave it enough nitrogen. It was a very distinct thing, very significant yield difference in terms of the corn, but it takes just a bit more moisture, but you have to give that corn a head start. I think, a lot of the work that Sharon Clay did with transcriptome analysis, the corn kind of, and Leon Reggie did a bunch too, that, you know, the corn has to have a little size before it gets competition. Otherwise it doesn't develop a good ear. There's our alfalfa in between our corn rows where it's everywhere. And then we've kind of had the most luck where we leave it in strip between the rows. And this is what it would be look like before we plant corn in the spring. So it's got a good start. It's using that part of the season that isn't being used right now in our continuous cornfield. So, and has been since 1990. We couldn't really keep the alfalfa alive if we didn't give it a gap because the corn would outcompete it. This is part of the Buffett thing. We flew cover crops into sunflowers was one of the big things we did in the fall. And here's a field where we got a good stand of flax, and the sunflowers are harvested, and then that was great for the next year, and they were going to go to spring wheat there. So they had that flax got enough resiliency, it hung around. And I know it looks like that thing's totally covered, but with sunflowers, it goes away pretty fast. So that thing would be pretty bare in the spring. Section intercropping, precision agricultural techniques may allow managing large areas with very small equipment. I was at a conference last year in January, very close to Silicon Valley, and they came in with a bunch of the stuff they're working on. And they have these little robots that are about the size of a softball that will go around, and they'll probably be able to pick crops or whatever, so they could go along and pick the grain and take it out of there and whatever. Now they just come in with a whole truckload of them. I was envisioning a coyote taking one home and letting these kids play with it. So I don't know what they're going to do about those kind of things, but they were pretty excited. But some kind of technique like that where it becomes more like it was in the old days, where you can handle that better. This concept will probably have applicability to high value crops first. Vegetables growing under trees probably is going to be one of the things we do. Pasture cropping is a version of this developed in Australia. Uses perennial warm season grasses. Kangaroo grass looks exactly like big blue stem, and according to Harvard, they're basically sisters. And they graze that during their hot, dry summer, where now they grow nothing because it's very hot and very dry in Australia in the summertime. And their crop season is actually during their cool, rainy winter. So this guy would grow the perennial grasses. He'd graze them with sheep, high intensity, short duration grazing in the summer, and then when they started to go dormant, or he'd make them go dormant, he'd plant his winter barley, oats, wheat, and canola type things and grow those for crops. Very effective. There's Colin Seiss. That's when I was there. I think that was in maybe 2006 or so. And then and that was one of his fields, and this was during his summer time. So he grew really good grasses. He came to visit us in February a few years ago, probably 5 years ago or so. Colin's on the left. Rolf Derps is the next guy. He's from Brazil and Paraguay, where they do a lot of cover cropping stuff, actually German originally. And then me, and then Dersu Gassan, and they were not happy with being here in February. They're all warm. Dersu is from Brazil as well, but they all have come from this polyculture cover cropping thing. Pasture cropping addresses the water and nutrient cycling concerns because it has that deep rooted thing, and it cycles it to the surfaces and keeps it going. When their native vegetation in Australia is a tree, and it has a deep rooting and it cycles things. And I tell you stories about how when they didn't cycle it, they get the salinity and they got the nutrients all going away. And the only place you'd have nutrients would be around a tree in a field. And because they just have the water cycle totally broken in the nutrient cycle. So that addresses that. It reduces his fertilizer nutrient use. He claims he doesn't really use any commercial fertilizer. He buys mineral for his sheep. But it requires this long, distinct growing season. So it doesn't really work that way in South Dakota, but the principle is pretty good to have that perennial coming in there at some point. And we're doing it a lot now. We're starting to do it with perennial sequences where we put in 5 years or something that's perennial and then cycle back to annual cropping. That's what they used to do. The forage need for him in the non-grazing phase was a concern. So he always planted some forage cool season crops to graze during that period of time because the warm season ones weren't growing at all. Has both perennial and annual components. Pesticides, FSA, crop insurance regulations are all issues if we do it here, and you're going to play that game. But it is a way of adding diversity to a low diversity perennial. So we use this in our system now that we have livestock. So this last summer, these are our calves from last fall.
Interseeded with peas, and the calf's first choice, of course, is to eat the peas. This is a stand of switchgrass.
Okay.
This is a stand of switchgrass, and part of it, including the part you see here, has been interseeded with peas, and the calf's first choice, of course, is to.
That was Cody Zilverberg speaking there. He's our livestock integration guy. But we have a crop rotation where we have pure stands of switchgrass there. Part of that field is used for seed, and then part is used for grazing. And then the grazing part we will come in and interseed cool season high protein things like peas, and then that increases the quality of that forage. And you know, the early settlers talked about grasses as high as the back of a horse. Well, that's exactly what those are. Relay cropping, crop 2 is seeded into crop 1 before crop 1 is harvested. This can be done aerially or mechanically. We tried to do it aerially. Jason Mock, I think his name is in the Corn Belt, is doing a lot of this mechanically, but we tried to do it aerially, and again, seed coatings and stuff, and a lot of that was back in the 80s. The seeding and harvesting operations become very, very complex. Soybean seeded in winter cereal is probably the most common. That's the one we were kind of doing. It's hard to get 2 crops in the same year. South Dakota growing season is just too short. Growing 1 forage crop, 1 grain crop is substantially easier. So herbicides have to be chosen really carefully there. Dependable rainfall or irrigation is needed, and small grain followed by a forage or cover crop is the other way to do it. And we do that one too, where we do a small grain first, well, we do a lot of the small grain followed by the forage crop, I guess. Harvesting winter cereal for forage followed by a soybean is harder, and because you got to get the forage off there. Grazing and swath grazing is difficult when the forage crop's the first one, because you got to get it gone and get planted. And we've done a bunch of different things to try to speed that up, but it's an issue. We do a lot of this one where the forage crop comes after the grain crop. So we would have harvested winter wheat here, and then here you see a mixture of oats and barley and peas and canola and or rapeseed or whatever, grazing rapeseed and kale. And then we'll swath that like that. It looks like this. We leave the swaths in the field. Keeps its quality all winter for us out here, because you're swathing it right around October, sometime right before the first hard freezes, and the weather gets cold and it stays really well. And we use our irrigators to move the fences, so our cattle, the hot wires hanging on the fence, you just move the irrigators and the cows move. And they do a wonderful job of cleaning it up and spreading the manure and the stubble from the stripper headed weed is still there. You can see the armors on the ground. So we don't disturb any of that. The Argentines did a lot of 7 years of pastures and 7 years of farming. This is the kind of, and then had cover crops and things in there. Hairy vetch was a big tool. This is a picture from 1996, and there you guys probably, a lot of you know Ron Elverson maybe, or Keith. I gave Ron a spade full of that soil to hold so I could take a picture. It's just probably the best soil structure I'd ever seen. 10 years later, when they got rid of the cattle and started growing soybeans on soybeans on soybeans, this is what it looks like. So it's important to remember to have enough carbon in the system to make it make your organic matter build. So the native prairie looked like this. This is our daughter's 15 years ago, and or longer. And the root systems go that deep, and we're not emulating that at all with what we're doing. So
thanks to everyone for joining today. Thanks for the presentation, Dwayne. We appreciate that. And for those of you who are enjoying getting on next week, we're going to cover oats, and the moderator is going to be David Karkey. And so if you're interested in growing oats, you can join us next week, Tuesday through Friday. And also just a reminder that we do send a survey out to all the attendees every week at the end of the week, which is a little bit more detailed than the poll. And so we appreciate if you guys could fill that. That lets us know how we're doing, and you know, maybe what subjects you'd like to see us cover in the future, and kind of helps us direct not just our seminars, but also our research. So thanks again for attending, and
we've got one from Anthony. If we enter a period of years similar to the Dirty 30s, what would your words of advice be? Words of advice, I'm guessing it's supposed to be.
well, the interesting thing is, and we've looked at that. We had a period in the early 2002 through 2006, where our years were actually more severe than the 30s. And so I'm not so sure that I'm as worried about the 30s as I am something really, really wet. I think we have more trouble dealing with that in South Dakota than the little bit dry thing, or the kind of dry. And we're not doing a very good job yet. I talk about just stopping the bleeding is what we've gotten done so far. We're not doing an excellent job in statewide in terms of managing moisture. There's some guys that are doing pretty well, but as we build organic matter, if we can get that done, once we get that done, or we put a perennial in to get that done, then I think we'll be much more resilient during those dry years. And but having perennials in the system somewhere is going to be important as well. So the biggest hurdle we have is to get the policy people. In a lot of the times that includes farmer groups, you know, like Farm Bureau, Farmers Union, corn, wheat, whatever. They tend to focus everything on this year's production and production of commodities we can sell directly without having to add value to them, like with cows and stuff. So, but the perennials, if we don't get the perennials in there, we'll end up looking like Europe, where the soils are degraded to the point that they're going to be hard to recover. Argentina, when they took their perennials out, and it hasn't been that long, and I was there not this last fall, but a year ago, last fall, and that's their summertime. And they have lakes in areas they've never had lakes. They got rivers forming in areas where they never had rivers, because their water cycle is so badly broken with nothing but soybeans, and for miles and miles. And I've been visiting there long enough, and I've had friends that have been there farming long enough that they know they have a major problem. but they're really not in a position to change that much. We, I think, can change some of those things if we start talking about it.
I know there's, Aaron is unmuted. I didn't know if you had a question, Aaron, or anybody else.
Unmuted, but the headphones are off. This whole subject that I talked about, everybody gets a kick out of playing with it. But, in the perennials, it's Cody's spending a lot of time to get diversity into our perennial pasture grazing things and whatever. And there you just do it automatically. In farm ground, it becomes a bit more difficult if you're going to harvest just grain. If you're doing forages again, it's easy and very automatic, other than with your cover crops, forage cover crops, you got to make sure you're not doing bridging diseases across. So where we're going to go to soybeans, for instance, our cover crop won't have any broadleaves in it. It'll just be a mixture of grasses because we want to use that year. And the thing we don't know for the next generation to find out is, if we have a mixture, does that bridge diseases the same as if we have a monoculture? And I suspect it doesn't. Suspect it's less of a bridge than if we had some kind of a monoculture, but we really don't have the data. And we've been doing some things, sending samples off to a lab that's supposed to be able to do DNA analysis for us on soils to tell us some of those things, but I think maybe they went broke, so because they're not sending us stuff back. And we haven't paid them money, so it's all right, but they gave us some sample bottles that we were supposed to get for free and do them, and they haven't done them, so I need to follow up on it. But those are the kind of things that somebody could really do a lot of research on in terms of what happens in the rotations. If you look at all of Randy Anderson's rotation work and our rotation work, a 4-year break is better than a 3-year break, which is better than a 2-year break. And how do you do that? These stacked rotations we'll talk about at Roost No-Till, South Dakota No-Till Association. Those type of things are good techniques for doing that, but we know they work. Now we maybe need to figure out exactly why.
You've got another one here, Dwayne. What's the percentage of farmers in South Dakota currently using these polycropping techniques?
I don't think the level in South Dakota is very large on the grain side. North Dakota more so. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, there's a lot of it. And Derek Axton, who spoke, was that 3 years ago at Horizons, Ruth? And I think he spoke last year at Watertown, the soil health thing. But he and his wife do almost everything as polycultures, and they have a big cleaning shed where they just pull everything in and it gets cleaned. So he feels the value is worth that. But again, they don't have the farm program thing. So there's a difference when you go across the border in terms of how they approach stuff. But peas and lentils are players here. Chickpeas are players. But we have these major corn, soybean, sunflower, wheat things that just predominate everything. So not very many people are playing.
Bert's wondering if you have any recent yield data from the corn alfalfa system you talked about.
Yeah, I have this year's stuff. I didn't really put it in there in this presentation, but yeah, we've got one, like 5-year average. We're probably going to change that now this year to actually start planting in annual along with it to increase what the alfalfa is doing. But I had it in there that the straight The straight treatment where we have just 20-inch corn rows, no alfalfa, no gabs, is the highest yielding, but it's only probably 220 versus 215, 212, something like that. And we haven't really tested how much nitrogen we're getting out of the alfalfa. I think we could back off our nitrogen where the alfalfa is, and that one would, if we backed off the nitrogen across the whole thing, then the alfalfa one would probably win. You know, but money says nitrogen is cheap right now, but it won't be. Maybe in 2, 3, or 4 years, that'll be a different deal.
Kurt's got another good one here. He's wondering if you think it's going to require a carbon tax for our eastern producers to stop using tillage as the climate policy.
Well, I don't know what's going to stop that. You know, circumstances will change that eventually. Hopefully they will figure it out without regulation. I can't imagine why people till, but I haven't done any tillage for 30 years. So it's really a foreign concept to me, but it's going to take something. And I think what would do it actually is to take the subsidy off of crop insurance. But I don't want to say that either. I'm not a policy guy. I don't want to wade into that, but I got a question today from Montana, or yesterday from Montana. The NRCS wants to subsidize the use of stripper heads in Montana, so more guys would use them. They don't want to use stripper heads in Montana. If you hire a custom combiner, he'll do, and most of them do have custom combiners. A custom combiner will run stripper heads for the same money as draper heads. And it actually makes him more money to use stripper heads. So if you gave him a choice, he would choose a stripper head himself because it's cheaper to run and you get more work done. And so I called a couple of my farmers, do you think they need to be subsidizing? And they go, well, no. But when we first tried to start stripper heads here, there's a lot of resistance here too. Nobody really wants to change what they're doing, including me. You know, I don't want to change. So unless, you know, I always say you don't change your eating habits until you had your first heart attack. And I think that's kind of what's going to happen eventually.
There's a couple more here. Anthony, we'll come back to yours. But Aaron's wondering, does having a headed out cereal rye crop in the spring ahead of soybeans improve the carbon situation when you're growing soybeans?
Well, you want to have it doing lignin. And we've done cereal rye here, but not very much because we have winter wheat breeding going on the farm. So we don't dare do that, but we have had cereal rye, and we want to get it to the point, if you're going to roll it, get it to the point where it has enough lignin to roll and crimp properly. And that does help you, in my opinion. And we use winter wheat. We don't roll it. We can't get it big enough to really roll it or crimp it. So we have to spray it, but we will plant that green and spray it later. And that works pretty good if you got Roundup Ready beans. If you have Liberty Link beans, Liberty doesn't do a good job of killing the cereals. So that's one of the really interesting things. And you can do it with clethodim, but that's not as good either. So I do think having it bigger helps, but
And then Anthony's asking if you could comment about the permaculture. Are there species we could use to be perennials in the permaculture?
in the pasture cropping thing.
I think that's what he's referring to.
Yeah, I think they're doing some of that. See, the cash crop in the case of Australia is wheat and canola and whatever, the cool season. I think they're trying some of this in Iowa using the cool season grasses, the Kentucky bluegrass type things and the fescues and orchard grass and some of those kind of guys, and grow them during their winter. But see, they have a much longer growing season, so we don't get as much out of those crops either. It's like doing cereal rye or winter wheat here after corn going to soybeans, or just, you don't get a heck of a lot done here unless you can get it started earlier. That's the issue. And those cool season grasses don't go as deep, which is an issue. And if you got drain tile, you don't want a perennial in there because you're going to plug your drain tile. So that's a bit of an issue. So I think it's a great trick. And I think we might be able to do like a little bit like they did with the narrow grass strips, you know, like we're doing with the alfalfa, but doing it with the grass strips in there. And I don't think the alfalfa strip is all bad if you look at it long term.
Anthony, were you going to add to that? Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm thinking more of like ornamental type species of plants that would be more low growing on the ground, and that wouldn't take a lot of control, but they would hang around and just fill the gaps in. That's kind of what I was thinking about permaculture.
No, and I think there's room for a lot of that. And I saw a thing in France where they did a fairly wide, say 200-foot wide strip of cropping, and then they had like 50 feet of bushes and things. This was in the Somme area where they had all the trenches in World War I. It's kind of an interesting place, but what they were doing with their 50-foot wide spots is that was where they grew their game birds. They had little, you know, I'm trying to think of the name of them, but they're, you know, little, almost like a pheasant, but not quite. Hungarian partridge, they're little partridge type thing. And they had those bushes in there, and they had little water tanks in there for the birds and little feeders. And they had the bushes to protect them from the prey animals. And they had people from England that would pay them lots of money to come and hunt those areas in between their fields. So it was kind of an interesting thing. And we saw some of the same thing. Ruth was with me then in England. She might not have been out with me the day I saw this, but you could see on the edges of their hedgerows where the predators, the beneficials, insects, were moving out in the field and controlling the insects in their wheat crop. And otherwise they had to use a lot of insecticides on them, but right along their edges, they didn't have to worry about it because the predators took care of it. So you get some of that kind of effect too, eventually. And I think that helps, you know, that kind of thing would help with our water cycle and whatever, where you have the perennials in there. But you notice in North Dakota, if you go up to Grand Forks, they used to have all those lines of trees in there, and that was designed to stop the wind erosion. And as soon as they went less tillage, they took all those out, but now they have a salinity problem.
Looks like Emmanuel's got a question in the chat. Is there potential for double cropping cash crops, early maturing winter wheat, and then 0-0 maturity beans?
Well, yeah, we did a bunch of that stuff, both double cropping and relay cropping and whatever, but you sacrifice on both crops. And if you start looking at the economics of it, it's not very good. You have way more risk, and your potential return is not double. It's not even close to double. And the Argentines, again, they'll pick on the Argentines. They were doing a rotation when they were in their non-pasture phase, when I first started dealing with them in the 90s. That was a corn, short season soybean, winter wheat, corn, winter wheat, then a short season soybean for them, that'd be like a group 4 or 5 would be their short season soybean. Well, if Emmanuel thinks about that rotation, corn to wheat to soybean, and then they turn around and go corn to wheat to soybean again. They just had huge problems for fusarium. They had all these other problems with that rotation. And I suggested, and you'll see this one in that virtual field day if you go there, but we had developed by that time this rotation where we do 2 years of corn, a soybean, a wheat, and a soybean. So you have this longer break. And what they could do with that was 2 years of corn or corn milo type thing, milo corn. And then a full season, which is group 8, 9, that type of thing, very long season soybean, and then the winter wheat, and then a cool season or short season soybean as a double crop. So it's a 4-year rotation for them. And that totally revolutionized what they were doing for a while. But now they do have some experiments going on now with perennial sequences coming back in there, and it's actually being done by the farmers because, they really don't have the university system like we have or used to have. So, they've got a fairly large demonstration farm that I visited last fall, and it's very distinct differences of recovering the soil, and they're getting a lot more productivity by having that perennial in there.
Sarah, I think I have a question here that was directed to me. So Jim's asking, he's been watching the 60-inch corn with interseeded covers, wondering how you would determine the value in this system or similar systems where there may be a cash crop yield cost, but yet there may be other values.
Well, yeah, I think the 60-inch corn, I'd rather see them try the double 2 30-inch rows and a 60-inch gap like we're doing. I think that they'd come much closer in the yield than every other one. But if you were going to graze the corn, and again, the Canadians grow a lot of corn that they graze with their cattle. So if you were going to graze that corn, you could do that one really well, I think, and you might be able to come out and take some of that corn out if you had the right hybrids there, and then graze that whole thing. And I think that really has a lot of fit. Again, I worry what I put in that inner row area there in that gap or in that skip, because I don't want to carry stuff across down the road. So some of this, cyst nematodes are one of those things that can come across, and you can take care of them if you do the right rotations. If you don't do the right rotations, they can set in and give you a lot of issues. So that's one of the things I worry about there. But yeah, I think from a grazing standpoint, there's a lot of things that can be done.
I don't see any other questions today. Thanks again for joining us. For those of you, apologize for the glitch with the technical issues, but we're glad we got that kind of worked out. And I guess that's going to be part of the risk of doing some of these online, that occasionally we might run into that. But fortunately, we overcame it today, and hopefully we learned something. But thanks again. Thanks to Dwayne.
If we met in person, we could have a blizzard.
Yeah, there's always something. Thanks for presenting today, Dwayne. We appreciate that. And
sorry for being incompetent at finding stuff on the, but anyway.
You got your wife to help you with that.
I know.
So yeah, thanks everyone. We'll appreciate you guys joining, and hopefully we'll see you next week on the oats webinars.